all you wouldn't mind us seeing you. It would be so great. Maybe not though, anyway. So, as you can see, my name is Ann Adams, and I am co-hosting this with David Green. And I'm just going to do a very short introduction of David Pepper. But I've known David for a very long time through my family. So there's a lot of my family and my nephews who are also very close to all the Pepper boys too. So, but I just really want to say a couple of things. And that is, part of what I've noticed over these last number of years is this whole notion of what does it mean to have the quality of conversation with other human beings that leaves you, really enlivened and energized and having us really want to take the next steps of whatever that might be. And as I look around at all of you and many of you that I've known for the Ulab hub that we're part of, this Reimagining Democracy, there's something about what's happening in our world right now that's generating a lot of energy to then go out and make the quality of difference that we want to make. So that's one of the reasons I'm just so excited that David said yes, that he would come and be with us, because he's the kind of person, that really, I just totally trust that what he has to say, and that he's doing some very innovative things in terms of discovering what's really underneath all of the aspects of in what does it take to reimagine and to create democracy. So I'm just really happy you're here, and I'll say more a little bit later, David, but just want to give you a chance to speak. So the other thing too, for the rest of us, please, if you want to, later, we're going to have a chance to have a conversation and questions if you'd like, and answers. And then there's a raised hand down here. So I want to make sure you use the raised hand, because then it puts you up right in the front there so we can see who wants to say things. But we want this to be, as much as possible, a flow. So it doesn't have to be too rigid. It doesn't have to be too stiff, but I just want to make sure we give David lots of time and space to be able to speak yourself. David Green, anything you want to add before I turn it over to David Pepper?
Sure. I just am really super excited. Read both of David's books and feel like he has so much knowledge to share about things that often get ignored, but are really important to democracy. And I think it's just a real opportunity for us to learn what we could do that we haven't paid attention to on a local and state level. So I'm just really grateful, David, you spent some time with us. Thank you.
Yeah. David, one last thing before you start too, is if you look around, this is part of a Reimagining Democracy. It comes from the MIT Ulab. So this is a hub of people that have been gathering for a number of years. So I just wanted you to also know that, so that there's an opportunity for you in the future where you want to have some access to people from the hub. I just want to make sure you know that that's certainly a possibility. And now I'll make sure I'll be zipping up now and giving it over to you. Thank you so much for saying yes, David. Thanks.
Of course, thank you, and yeah, really excited to meet everybody, and I'll hopefully have a lot of conversations so I get a sense of who's here and how we can work together. So, by the way, I'm in a hotel conference room. I hope the echo isn't too bad. Can you hear me okay? So, I'll get right to it. I talk a lot about democracy. I love that your theme is reimagining democracy, because it's exactly what we have to do. One of my main themes is not just reimagining it, but seeing it clearly how it works and isn't working. And one of the reasons I started writing these books a couple of years ago was, and I didn't, I don't think I brought any special knowledge to it, but once you really look closely at the breakdown of democracy, it's so clear, but it's also it's such a different frame of why it's broken. I'm going to present that we're presented as a country. And most of the national conversation about the breakdown of democracy, I'm not going to go through my long presentations here. You'll be glad to know, because I want to have a conversation. But much of the national conversation about the breakdown of democracy would have you think that it's a federal breakdown, that's the problem. It's the splintering of in Congress, it's the presidential election, it's Donald Trump. And yes, looking at that picture and all those pictures is bad. I mean, it's not a pretty picture, and there are real risks at that level. But the real issue that I've sort of gotten obsessed by is, long before any of that, the breakdown began years ago at local and state government. And when local and especially state government, I'll just share this slide. I won't go through a lot of this for you, but you know, to use that old James Carville, the crisis of American democracy, it's the state house is stupid. That's the heart of the problem. Before you get to Congress, before you know, Trump emerges, what you've had in this country since about 11 is a true meltdown at the state level of any sense of viable democracy. And that might feel, you know, okay, well, David, who cares if Tennessee is no longer has almost any qualities of a functioning democracy? Who cares if Missouri or Ohio even is so gerrymandered, there's no elections left, there's almost no one running in some of these states? That's a problem maybe for people in those states, but why is it a bigger problem? Once you put together, and I go through this in my books, the power of these state houses on every issue in our lives, and every major issue contested in politics today, from a woman's right to choose to what's taught in schools to gun laws. Once you add in the fact that these states are where democracy itself is shaped, the laws about who votes, when they vote, how they vote, which lets you shape who the electorate is. Once you add in the fact that these states are the ones that draw the district lines, and in the right hands, that can mean representative and fair districts. In the wrong hands, it can mean that basically you have no democracy. It's structured that there's no accountability. Once you see that a breakdown of democracy at the state house level is the breakdown of a democracy at the national level. And once this happens as well, what you see is, because I go through all this in great detail, state houses have major control over federal, statewide, and local. Once you see that the Achilles heel of our democracy, in the wrong hands at least, are these state houses, what you end up seeing is that most of the biggest topics in American politics today don't go through Congress. They don't need to. And Congress is high profile enough, with enough swing states for Senate races and House seats, that going through Congress, if it's really controversial things you're pushing, won't work. They won't do it. But in state houses that are gerrymandered to a hilt, where voters are being suppressed, those turn out to be the place where you can get a lot of the things that you want done in an undemocratic way, where people can't be held accountable. And that's really the threat. And that's the challenge that we face. And this preceded Trump running for anything. This continued after 2020 when he lost. It didn't slow down at all. It actually accelerated. And so I feel like Paul Revere trying to wake people up. My call out, as I talk all the time, is if we don't more broadly define how and broadly understand how our democracy is shaped, and that it's especially anchored at the state level, and we don't see that is where, in many, many states, it's essentially no longer a democracy. If we don't see that and start to try and correct for that, federal elections, as important as they are, will not fix that problem. And let me just go through a couple slides real quick that walk through how bad it is. And then we can open it up. This is not just an eye test. This is the states of our country in 2022. How many of this is that second to the last column to the right. That's the percentage of Republican legislators in these states that did not face an opponent in 2022. Look at those numbers. So we're not only talking about a gerrymandered system where you're probably going to win. You're talking about a system where in Louisiana, 81% of incumbents didn't even have an opponent. North Carolina, 42%. Arkansas, 43%. So you're talking about, it's kind of like what Jim Crow is like. There's no choice. In Texas, they literally label these races as canceled. So you have all these people in power exercising huge power over every issue we care about. And in many places, their entire career, they're not even challenged. They don't even face an opposition. And part of the theory of my book is when you have, sorry to bounce around so much, when you have a system with no accountability and people largely spending careers without a challenge, the incentives in these states become perverse or warped. The incentive of being a public servant disappears because the public no longer really has a choice in whether or not you stay in office. It becomes an incentive to serve the private using public resources, an incentive to be mainstream that we think is how politics is sort of shaped disappears and is replaced by an incentive to be extreme, because that's the only way you'd ever lose the primaries if you weren't extreme enough. You have an incentive to keep attacking democracy, because if you stop and you allow fair districts, you're probably going to lose if you spent your career as an extremist not caring about the public interest. So you have in these broken states where many of these people spend careers without opposition, you have this meltdown where so much of what we assume is for public service is warped into something very different. And this is why in many states, and I'm from Ohio, I could say this about Ohio, but Iowa, Missouri, Tennessee, you see a downward spiral into unaccountable extremism and terrible outcomes. Schools declining, schools 4 days a week, laws getting rid of things like child labor protection, you name it. It's all happening, and it's happening in places where there's no political accountability left. So that's the very sobering thing. I know we're going to get to the positive second, but my view is until you see that, you don't see the real problem, which is at the state level, our democracy is dissipated down to almost nothing. And there's a lawlessness to many of these places because there's no accountability. So that's the negative. The positive is, and this gets back to reimagining democracy, once you see that, you actually realize there's so much more we can all do to lift democracy than we've been doing. We've been left to think, as people care about democracy, and it's the most disempowering false narrative imaginable. We've been left to think that the only way to save democracy is to somehow win a few swing states for a federal election. That's how we do it, right? And when we've won those races, we celebrate like we just won it all. But that leaves most of America thinking, well, I'm not in the battle then because I don't live in Pennsylvania or Georgia or Wisconsin. Or I may not be a huge fan of Joe Biden, so I can't get that excited about him, but I care about democracy. What can I do? And we've defined the battle for democracy so narrowly as if it's only about a few federal races that we basically told people, most of you, millions, wherever you live, that's not the battle. Well, my conclusion is it's all the battle. If you are in, going back to that, sorry, I don't mean to bounce around. I know it's hard to look at. If you're in one of these states with all these uncontested races, I don't care how red it is, you're in the battle. You need to get to run. You need people to run more. If you're in a state where it's been rampant voter suppression, like Ohio, you're in the battle. You need to use every part of your footprint to re-register people who've been purged from the rolls or suppressed from the rolls. I don't care what state it is. So the point of my sort of the opening being negative is, once you see the battles in many more states and at many more levels than a few federal races for the U.S. Senate, it puts all of us on the front line of the battle. And there's so much more we can all do to protect democracy than we ever realize when we're given that very narrow federal swing state frame. And this, I won't go through this in great detail here. By the way, I can send you this PowerPoint if you want to distribute it after. But it's a long battle. It's not just about every 2 years, a few federal races. In the long battle for democracy, that's a complete losing mindset. You think that John Lewis or the suffragists only worried about democracy in the fall of even years and then went on vacation in December? Of course not. We're in the same battle they were in, but we're fighting it like we're not. I mentioned Stacey Abrams, a law school classmate of mine. She understood the long battle that she faced in Georgia, and she fought it all that time in all sorts of ways, way beyond partisan politics. It's a battle that is all 50 states. We can no longer accept that dozens of states of this country are no longer functioning democracies. We've allowed ourselves to accept that because we think the only thing that matters is a few federal offices. I'm in these states all the time, so I feel it quite personally. When I show up in Oklahoma and the people are scared to even campaign, and it's extremism way beyond the people of Oklahoma believe, it's just wrong that we don't try and change that in Oklahoma. that we basically have decided it's okay for that to happen because somehow there won't be an Oklahoma U.S. Senate race that we care about. That's just we're literally not fighting for democracy on purpose in so many states. And at some point, it's just wrong. And the result of that decision is what? It's unchecked extremism. Because if only one side is even in the debate, it's one extremist fighting another extremist, and there's no one else even in the state saying, well, actually, neither of you represent the mainstream views of the state. And when people decide it's not worth fighting in these states because you can't win a federal Senate seat there, we are leaving it to become a downward spiral. And that's why whatever your politics, and I don't know everyone's politics on this call, look at this map for a second. Indiana voted for Obama. Iowa voted for Obama. North Carolina voted for Obama. Ohio, Florida. Well, some of these states are going through downward spirals of extremism. You would never know that they voted for Obama only 10 years ago. But that's what happens when one side abandons a state and leaves it only to the others to fight over. It becomes that downward spiral. We have to start focusing on far more than just the places that, Democrats think they can win. You're not really going to change this picture unless you start having contests and accountability in districts across states, including rural. And right now, going back to that chart I showed you, most of the uncontested races are in rural America, and that's where most of the extremism is getting through. And there's no one even running, so it gets worse. You want to have a contested democracy all over. That brings accountability back into the system. This is much bigger than just one person running. Of course, I believe, and I don't know everyone on here, I assume most agree, Donald Trump is clearly a threat to democracy. But he lost in 20, and the undermining democracy didn't stop, and that's not only because of him. It continued full bore in these states. And unless we start defining this battle as not just about one person or one party, but about a belief in democracy or not, those are the sides. If you can break bread and work with people of the other party, like a Liz Cheney or an Adam Kinzinger, do it. We have to have a multi-partisan coalition that protects democracy. That's actually what we did in Ohio last year when we protected our ability to go to the polls with something you might have all heard of called Issue 1. That was a multi-partisan coalition that saved our democracy with a 57% victory. And the last thing, and I'll stop talking here, I think I'm just over my 15 minutes. Once you see that you're in a battle for democracy and it's the front line is everywhere and it's not only partisan, my hope is people really see, my gosh, there's so much more they could do than they ever realized to protect democracy. The nonprofit they volunteer for could be registering voters, the business they work for or lead, the places where they donate, the university they went to, the person running in a tough district that needs their help, even though it's not going to, create a U.S. House seat. There's so many more ways to lift democracy once you see the big picture for what it is than we ever imagined. And this is where I walk through what I call my footprint. And I challenge people. You have a whole footprint of influence in this world. And I'm sure on this call, among the 21 people, you add up all your footprints collectively, it's a heck of a group with a big set of networks. And what I worry that we're doing is because we've cabined our view of democracy as swing states and super partisan, we only use tiny elements of our footprint to lift democracy. We give some money, maybe we give some time, that's about it. When the truth is, every part about our life could be used to lift democracy if we see it the right way. And we just haven't been doing that. And I go through a lot of case studies and examples in the book where all of us could be playing roles to lift democracy that we often think are only about our political involvement, when in fact there are other ways that frankly could be even more effective. I mentioned this at a talk about a year ago about how we could all be using nonprofits we're involved with to register purge voters, because 50% of America does not vote, it doesn't participate. And a guy from Cincinnati was the head of the Cincinnati Board of Public Health, or had been. And they operate 10 health clinics in the city. And I had mentioned every health clinic could be registering everyone who walked in those doors. And when he was done, he said, well, I can go ask to do that. He began a process to do that. Every homeless shelter in Ohio should be registering all those folks. So the point is, think about your own footprint, all the things you can do. Sherrod Brown, when he's senator now, but when he was Secretary of State, he worked with McDonald's to have a voter registration form on every tray at McDonald's in the state. That's an enormous scale of lifting democracy. And my worry is that we've defined the battle for democracy in a way that so many of the most scalable ways we can lift democracy, we've taken off the table because we don't think that it's appropriate, because we think it's partisan and only in a few states. Once you realize, no, it's much bigger than that, there's a lot more we could all do. So with that, I'll stop talking. I'm excited to be with you today. I'd love to hear your questions, your comments, your responses, and then maybe answer specifics about how we can all do this and do this year, and then do it long term.
Yeah. David,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much. What I want to do just for a moment, maybe 30 seconds or maybe even a minute, is just everybody take a long, deep breath and just really allow what has been happening here in the last 15 minutes, just to enter your body, into your emotions, whatever, and really get a sense of it. But I'm going to invite you, and I know that there were some people who they're in the chat where they had questions. So I'm going to invite those of you that put them in the chat that you may want to raise your hand by the automatic one. But I just want you to take just a moment. I'm going to be quiet. Just be quiet and kind of notice what's happening here in this conversation with you and I and all of us. Yeah, thank you. Just sometimes it's really important just to be quiet and kind of notice. David, thank you so much. I mean, partly how I'm practicing my listening is I'm listening with my heart, and I'm listening with my belly, and I'm listening with my emotions. And you certainly covered all the areas there. So one thing I do want to add for myself is I am a commitment to transforming education in the United States. And so one of the things that I notice as you're speaking is we do not educate for democracy in this country.
No, we
And
don't.
we should start at little babies, in kindergarten and elementary school, whatever, so that people have an experience where they're embodying what David's been talking about. So it's just, of course, that's the way it is. We listen, we cooperate, and it needs people who actually are human beings in order to really co-create democracy.
Yeah.
Not human doings and not identities out there trying to be better than somebody else. So I just want to bring that up as part of the conversation. And I'm going to be quiet now and just invite, are there people out here?
I could take some of the questions in the chat. Well, one, I agree with you. In many ways, my first book especially is of it trying to make it more dramatic so people read it. It's a basic civics lesson on the heart of how democracy works. And one thing I try and do in that book that we don't do a very good job of when we teach democracy is so much of what I do is through storytelling. If I had written a book called The State Houses of America, no one would have read it. If I had started each chapter saying, this is the power of a state house, no one would read that chapter. We have to, I think, bring more dynamism to how we talk about democracy, how it works. And by the way, I say this as a lawyer who teaches at law school. The lawyers are the worst at this. We teach everything through cases and case law. And one of the things I've started to do I teach a class on election law and voting rights. And we leave out the exciting stuff, which is every case with a name in it that's made it to the Supreme Court, let's say in the late 1800s or early 1900s, that was a victory for voting rights. The name in that case, that plaintiff, is an absolute hero. But we strip the story of their heroism, that they were some suppressed Black voter in the 1890s who went all the way to the Supreme Court and in some cases won the greatest underdog victory. And all we do is say, well, this case is about this principle. And we leave it out. And I think one reason why people aren't picking up on the civics and democracy, as you said, is we too often strip it of the human story, which in many cases is absolute courage and heroism that got us to key moments. So I see Cindy has her hand raised. I'll then go to the questions on the side, but since Cindy's got
Great, thanks, David. Go ahead, Cindy. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for taking. I have to jump off in a minute to attend a national briefing on the new SAVE Act. I don't know if you've heard about this. This is the new congressional bill that would require proof of citizenship to register and vote. So I got to attend that. But one of my questions is, and thank you so much, David, for sharing this information. You're going to be speaking at one of our democracy happy hours in a couple of weeks. So we're excited to hear about that. What would you say? I work in democracy. My name is Cindy Black. I'm out of Washington State with Fixed Democracy First. And so that's all I do is work on democracy issues. What would you identify as two top democracy reforms that you think could make a real difference and how democracy works in the country?
Great question. And yeah, I know your name from our emails back and forth about our upcoming thing. I think, right now in Ohio, we are leading in every state who can do this, and only so many can. We have an effort for a citizen-led commission to do this. Picks up on Duncan's question about gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is at the heart of so much of the problem. And then you get the uncontested races that flow from gerrymandering. Getting the politicians who have all the bias away from the table that draws the maps is a massive need. Having some rules they have to follow is better than nothing, but they show they will break the rules to keep power. So the best reform, I think, right now in many states is an independent panel, a balanced panel with certain ground rules. They draw the maps of the state house and the Congress. They draw fair maps. Michigan did this a couple years ago. It led to races in all districts. And I think it's led to a better Michigan that better reflects their state. So Ohio is trying to do this year. They will fight it as hard as they can, because when you get rid of gerrymandering, you're going for the holy grail of how this model has stayed in power. But my hope is states that can do this, do it. And then on the flip side, my hope is, and this is sort of this only happens if certain elections go the right way. I think Congress, if things align, the first thing it should do when it has the opportunity is pass some of the federal bills that would not only end gerrymandering, but kind of rebuild the damage to the Voting Rights Act after the Shelby County case. So the gerrymandering push at both the state and federal level, I think, really important. I've become more and more interested in things like primary reform as well. Trying to get the incentive. Right now, the primary is where the extremism is so hyper incentivized. And if you create some reform, the Alaska reform, where it's a nonpartisan primary with a the runoff process, that has gotten rid of some of the worst of it, worst of the extremism. I'm a believer that in Ohio, J.D. Vance, I don't think anyone should change who they are. That kind of scares me, but he ran to the right because he thought he had to win a primary. Now we're stuck with a guy who hated Trump 6 years ago showing up at the court yesterday. If we had had a system where you win the primary by being a moderate, my guess is J.D. Vance would have been that. And so we have a primary system that really incentivizes being extremist. Mm-hmm. And I think there are reforms that actually would reverse that incentive. And we're seeing those play out in some ranked. It's sort of a nonpartisan primary and then a ranked choice runoff. In both steps, put a premium on actually having a big coalition and not only an extreme coalition. Duncan, on your question, Cindy, do you have any more questions? That was sort of two reforms.
No, I'll just add that we are working on an independent redistricting commission in Washington State with the League of Women Voters, but we're also working on proportional representation system for the long game, as you said. So, because we think that can get rid of gerrymandering altogether.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. I look forward to your presentation with our Democracy Happy Hour. Sorry I have to jump off, but thanks everyone.
Thank you, Cindy, for being here and all the things that you're doing, Cindy. Thank you very much.
So Duncan, so this goes back to both questions. I think a number of Democratic states, and others too, by the way, Arizona, have moved to a better approach to gerrymandering. One of the things I like about California, I'm not an expert on their entire system, but I was with a state senator 6 months ago, and no matter what in California, you have a November election and you don't have it canceled. You don't not have an opponent. So even in a more Democratic area, you do face accountability in November. And one theme of mine is that accountability is key. When I was an elected official, which I was, knowing I had a contested November election made me want to serve. I would have done it anyway, but not everyone does, unfortunately. I knew that in the end, the public was in charge of my reelection. It's up to them. I knew in the end that if I were to go crazy in one crazy extreme direction, I wouldn't get reelected. Or if I delivered terrible public outcomes, I would lose. That was the check. And you think about it when you're in office. And once you have a system, in all these states have them, where literally in Texas, half the elections are canceled, it really changes the entire dynamic of being in office. To put it bluntly, I actually think in many of these states, they stop being public servants. It's not about public service. it becomes this very warped, it's power, but it's power that's often serving private interests, using public power and public dollars.
Yes. Thank you.
And in the broken systems I'm describing, you get ahead if you do that well. If you, we had a real, and this is not only partisan. And there's a push right now for universal vouchers where it's taking the old model of vouchers and turning it into this like runaway freight train of billions of dollars flowing into private schools to families that already were going to private schools and could afford them. And a bunch of Republicans in Texas, to their credit, in rural Texas, voted against this because they knew this would destroy their rural public schools. Well, they were all primaried. Dark money flowed in from the DeVoses, and almost every one of them lost. Why? Because for my guess is they're very conservative. I wouldn't even call them moderates. For one moment, they said, I'm going to vote for the interests of my public district that I represent and not for the private interests who want this money for other reasons. And for that one moment, I wouldn't even call it moderation. I'd say that one moment of public service where they put the interests of their district over these state house, sort of national conservative priorities, they were primaried and they almost entirely lost. And so I do think what we're seeing in these states is sort of it's not public service anymore. It's using public power to benefit certain private interests, usually at the expense of the public.
Yeah. Thank you. Wow. You have a hand raised over here with
Victoria?
Yeah.
You're on mute.
You got to get unmuted. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Victoria
That's okay.
Hattersley, Washington State. I'm a colleague of Cindy's. We're implementing, piloting a democracy hub in the state. And I had just 2 points. One was in the chat. Are there also a similar number of Democratic candidates who are not primaried? And number two, I don't have the names and the details, but I know there's been some in the ether of recognizing the problem that you're pointing out and working to provide funds for Democrats to go in and primary. So there's there's something out there that's happening. It's clearly enough, but right. So there's
two things. So in these red states, they've ratcheted down the Democratic districts so much. There's some uncontested, but they're in the super minority. I was on the phone with some Utah legislators the other day. They have like, I don't know, it was like 15 out of 80 seats. And the point of gerrymandering is you so pack that district. The whole point is you overpack it with Democrats. So my guess is, it's probably an 80-20 district and not a lot of Republicans run. They don't care because they've got the other 80% of the districts. So it's not going to be the equivalent, but the natural response to their gerrymandering method will be that they don't care about those districts. They don't run in them. What's interesting though on the Democratic side, which is, I don't know why it plays out differently. On the Democratic side, it isn't the case that the further left always wins. We have a congresswoman from in the primary, I mean. It doesn't seem to, and maybe it's because the dark money isn't as prevalent, but you have in many districts that I've watched, you don't have the member of Congress feeling like I think the ones on the Republican side feel, unless they toe the most extreme line of their party, they will lose. Because I've watched, people like a Tim Ryan in Ohio or a Joyce Beatty who maybe have a challenge from their left and they win at 80-20. So there's something different happening where certainly some on the left will beat some in the center on the Democratic primary, but it's not the same sort of, like the one in Texas I described. It's not the same dynamic where if you run afoul and you are called a rhino, at this point, you are out. And we don't have that as much. The second I'm sorry, your second question was, here's the good news. So I don't mean to be so bleak. Like my point is, and you all are involved enough that you see a lot of this already. My main point in all that I do, and I'm always running around the country talking about this stuff, is to make people see the losing proposition they're stuck in so they reframe their battle. I think it's working. People do my whole point is, and Ann, you did this well by saying, take it all in. Like sometimes when I'm done, the room just kind of stares at me like, that's the most depressing thing I've ever heard. But my goal is to have people never forget that the frame is different than what we thought it was. And once you see the new frame, my hope is it leads you thinking, okay, I see what we have to do now. It's clear. And the good news is, not just me, but others, we have changed the expectation by showing how problematic it is to not run in half these places. So in the last 2 years, there's been an incredible dynamism in many states about running everywhere. You saw that let me go through this for a little bit. This is the good news, and I'm glad you got to this. I normally do my own presentation, but I want to go fast. See this chart here? Look at North Carolina. 30 uncontested races of Republicans in North Carolina. Do you know what? That was 22. Do you know what the number is this year? 2. A 25-year-old new rural North Carolinian woman became the chair of the party. And she said, no more, we're going to let these rural districts be uncontested. And she went like gangbusters and she recruited all the way down to 2. Florida, 30, look at that, 34 uncontested, 40%. They're down to about 2 or 3 as well.
Yeah.
The new chair, some activists. I got a call once from some higher ups in the Democratic Party saying a couple of years ago, hey, David, could you stop talking about this so much? Because you're making people look bad when they have all these uncontested races. And I wasn't a jerk about it, but I thought, good. It needs to be unacceptable. So look at Tennessee. Tennessee, 49% uncontested. 49% of the people who voted out those 2 Justins were uncontested the year before. Of course, they're going to act like they acted. That number is now down to, I think, 20%. So to your point, Victoria, yeah, there is a momentum that's building. And how would I frame it beyond just running? Once you see it as a democracy problem that we're not running all these places, that hopefully forces us to shift. We have to value running everywhere. And we just haven't valued it. We've literally been sending a signal for several years. Not only do we not care if you run everywhere, we think it's a waste to run everywhere. Well, that's a waste of money. Why would we help you? That could go to, think about, why would you ever run for anything if you were being told it's a waste? So we have to say in recruiting, in dollars, and I've created some organizations in different states. In Ohio, one's called Blue Ohio. We crowdfund monthly contributions. And we passed out some checks a couple weeks ago. We take the money we raise through our community of people who value these races, and we hand it out to the state representative candidates in the hardest districts first. The swing districts will get a lot of money, but in that little rural town where there's no Democrats to be found, they can't put $1,000 together. So we sent them checks a few weeks ago for $4,000.
Nice.
We supported 57. This is all from $10 activist giving. We supported 2 weeks ago 57 candidates across Ohio. No one else is doing that. Together, before we sent the checks out, those 57 candidates had 120,000 among all 57. When we were done sending our checks out, they had 400,000 among all 57. And so the point is, but that's just the money. We need to train. We need to volunteer. We have to provide other support. Forevermore, this is long game, as Cindy mentioned, we have to wrap these candidates running in tough places with the fact that we really value it. We see that it's a patriotic act. And the harder the district, frankly, the more courageous they are. And so the good news is, I'm so glad, yes, it is changing. We have to just keep pushing and pushing and no longer let it be acceptable that, we leave half of America without any choice in elections.
And just one more point on that is that even if there's not a chance for them to win, the point is it causes the Republicans to have to put resources there. So that's
absolutely
why bother if I can't win? Well, you start somewhere and
they're knocking on doors. It lifts turnout. They're on message in a place that we wouldn't have otherwise had message.
Yep.
And like you said, they're forcing people to put money. One of the benefits, if you've been in office for years and you never had an opponent, when you do, you're really scared. You've never faced someone knocking on doors saying you're an extreme. So the people who face that opponent are actually more freaked out than maybe they even should be. And they'll say to their caucus chair, no, I'm not sending you any money. I have an opponent this time. these are candidates who probably didn't even have to worry about a walk list before having to figure it out. So I have a really cool story. I do a Substack that if you're interested in this stuff, you should follow it. Almost everything I do has no paywall. I did a really cool story the other day. The story wasn't cool. My story wasn't cool, but the story I shared was great. In Arizona, talking about another reform, and Cindy asked about reforms. In Arizona, I spoke to a group in a rural county called Yavapai County the other day. This is where a town called Prescott is, home of Barry Goldwater. Well, I spoke a couple years ago to this county, and I told them everything we're talking about, that running has a value even if you lose. You narrow the margin, you knock on doors. Well, a couple people there got apparently so excited about what I said, they went out and recruited in districts that haven't had competition. But they didn't just recruit, they showed each of these candidates how to run their campaign so they're eligible for public financing, because Arizona has public financing. So not only will not a single district in Arizona not have a candidate, we will have a candidate in every legislative district in Arizona. In a whole lot of them, they will literally have $50,000 each of public financing. And they run 3 per district. So as a team, they will have $150,000. And going to your point, if you're the incumbent and you hear that, you bet you're not putting your money anywhere else, because you all of a sudden have candidates running with deep pockets thanks to a public financing system. That's the Arizona story I talk about, but it's just one example of creatively running everywhere. And in that case, taking advantage of the fact that Arizona, to its credit, has a system that allowed these candidates in rural Arizona to have some real resources.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. We have David.
Yeah, so one of the things you talk a lot about in both your books is voter registration, voter purging, things like that, and ways that we can help get people registered, like the McDonald's tray story.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if like, for example, I run a couple different websites. Is there a link I could add that would help people who are showing up to that website either get registered, but I guess I'm also concerned beyond registration in terms of being informed. It seems like that to me is the bigger gap, even more than registration.
Well, it's both, but I'm going to give a link to my website here. The numbers are staggering about the non-involvement of Americans in democracy. Staggering. Everything would change if we moved from 50% participation consistently to 75%. Our voting percentages are all based upon who's registered. So it's a misleadingly high, because so many are just not participating at all. And one of my theories is, and I can say this having been the chair of the Democratic Party, the Democrats don't do nearly enough to change this problem. Because let's say you're a Democratic, activist making calls late, you're basically calling the people who vote every time. You're calling the people who are already registered. You're not given a list of people who aren't registered, because that would be viewed as a very inefficient activity for you to do to win a campaign. So the world is split into the registered and relatively active voters and the completely unengaged inactive voters, and almost the entire political infrastructure is spent on the people who are already engaged. And so this is where I put in this link here. None of us should count on the formal party to change that. And except for maybe a presidential campaign, most campaigns don't have nearly the capacity to do the work to get to these less engaged voters, if someone has decided, by the way, that democracy, it doesn't matter to their life and voting doesn't, you can't just change it by knocking on a door. That takes more engagement. And so the part of my book that I go through is many of the most important ways we can re-engage these people are going to be the non-political activity. We are serving people who are disengaged from politics all the time, at health clinics, at homeless shelters, at food banks, at stores, at nonprofits. And those are often the best communicators of why someone should get engaged. And that's why I think it's not only a scale issue. If every health clinic, if every homeless shelter registered people, we'd have more registration. It's the broader engagement. Wouldn't it be better to have the nurse at the health clinic who just made your child feel better be the one to bring up, hey, are you registered? Do you vote? Well, here's our kiosk right in our clinic where you can do that. And you should, because longer term, that might help the health of your child. That's the much better communicator. So you're talking to the disengaged voter with the person who should be talking to them versus, no offense, because this is important work too, the person running down the street with a clipboard bugging you if you're registered. That's not the best messenger. So I do think there's a lot to do, and I give ideas on that. And a lot of it, by the way, we need to break down the barrier that this is inappropriate activity for organizations. And my worry is that once we make it all partisan, a lot of nonprofits, a lot of businesses feel like, oh, I can't do registration. That's too political. And right now, unfortunately, the Republicans in some cases are trying to make it feel that way. So one of the key places I go to, David, in my website here is there are places that do training about what is appropriate voter engagement for a nonprofit. What is an appropriate nonpartisan engagement? And if going back to Cindy's question about reforms, if I could do one step, it would be that all across the country, nonprofits, city halls, libraries, they all trained up on what they can do and can't do and started doing what they can, because there's a lot more they can do. And I think again and again, they would be the far better messengers to this disengaged part we're talking about than the political players.
Okay, I'm gonna go next.
Okay.
Called on myself. Again, I'm gonna ask all of us just for, 15, maybe 20, maybe 30 seconds, just to be quiet and begin to notice, like, what's going on with you right now? There's all these different kinds of ideas and things that are there, and there's lots of conversation. So the invitation as we get closer to closing today is to keep asking you, what's there for you about this conversation? What really has your heart or your belly or your emotions, light up? Because that's really what we want to take a look at. And I'm just going to suggest a few things. But for me, I know that David said we can have this PowerPoint. So I'm going to make sure we have the PowerPoint, make sure that every one of you get the PowerPoint. And then to look to see, is there a group of people that's in your community or in your schools or, in any area in your life where you might want to gather a group of people and have this particular conversation. So for me, I noticed that, there's a lot of energy around this whole thing. And then I just want to hone in to realize that I am really committed to what you've been speaking, David, and to begin to take a look at who are the ones that are here from the hub or those of you that are here from Transforming Education, to really ask the question, what can we be doing about this? Go beyond what we've been doing. But anyway, thank you very much. I just wanted to keep inviting you that way. Thanks. And then we can turn it over to Dave.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm new to the group, so I'm the head of a United Nations Association chapter in Orange County, California. I'm nonpartisan. I totally agree with you on the need for nonprofits to advocate more for engagement and to understand what they can and can't do. And usually it just boils down, they can't advocate for a person, but they can certainly advocate for engagement, and they can advocate for issues, right? And so, that's, what any advocacy nonprofit group will do in talking to folks about the issues like ours, which would be human rights. But my point that I put into the chat, two things really. One is, and you've mentioned them, Andrew Yang brings up the ranked choice voting and the open primaries as two major things to focus on, that if we could try to get more of our communities engaged, that would really help. Right. So just, you mentioned that, so maybe just comment on that. And then the other thing is that, many voters are turning into NPPs or no party preference voters, call them independents. That's a growing group. And in many cases, it's almost even in many communities to however many Republicans or Dems there might be. Certainly here, we're kind of in that space in Orange County, which used to be heavily red. And it feels to me like that group does not have anybody speaking for them generally. Yeah. That they're kind of a group that doesn't feel like they have any real representation, because they tend to be fiscally conservative, want accountability on dollars and where they're spent, but also socially progressive. And my feeling towards when I attend Democratic Party meetings is that, hey, you know, didn't it make sense for you to pay more attention to the independent voter, try to attract them more? You're going to have your more than likely your Democratic voters are likely going to go with you. What's your thought about that?
Yeah, I agree on both. By the way, I love your backdrop there.
Oh, thanks.
Let's go get all those things done.
Yeah.
And by the way, I had a great visit to Orange County like 3 months ago. I spoke to your League of Women Voters there.
Oh, yeah.
And, it was really fun. I'm going to be back in, I'll be back in the fall.
Oh, great.
Yeah, no,
Good for
I
you.
agree on both. I mean, I think that, like I said, the primary, and what you'll see is, again, this is not just a partisan battle between Republicans and Democrats. A lot of the battles Republican versus Republican. You know, why would they gerrymander a state that they're going to win anyway? It's because the gerrymandering helps make sure that the Republicans in power are the extreme ones versus the moderates. And that's one reason why in Ohio, they're trying to shut down a primary system, which is pretty open. Because an open primary allows more moderate Republicans to succeed. That's how Kasich beat Trump, for example, in Ohio. And a closed primary gives an advantage to the extremists. So what's interesting is while we push, that you almost can see what we should do by what they do. When you see them fighting against open primaries or ranked choice because of what happened to Sarah Palin, it's because they want the more extreme to win. And the Republicans in power who are extreme, they do not want the moderates to win. They want them gone. Right. And one of the things that forever frustrates me is moderate Republicans sometimes are literally going along with the very tools that are putting them out of business. You know, gerrymandering, Citizens United, even though it's being used against them. Yeah. But so I do agree with those reforms. And I do think that, you know, I think the younger generations are also not that into the institutions of the parties.
Right.
And I think that the old sort of just party talk, and I'm a Democrat, I was the chair, but I'm happy to say this. I think the more we frame a lot of these issues around democracy, and you heard me try and do it at the end, about issues themselves, the kind of things behind you, yep, the better off we are. Because if you go into Kansas and talk, hey, Democrat, 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 you'll lose. But when there was a referendum in Kansas about reproductive freedom, it won 60-40. Just like in Ohio, we won our reproductive freedom amendment 57-43. It was multi-partisan, and independents hugely went in the same direction as Democrats. So right. I think the more we really focus in on the issues that affect people's everyday lives, we can win over. And in some states, if you're not doing this, you're going to lose. In Florida, and by the way, what's interesting to your question is I had a meeting a few months ago with all the Democratic chairs of Florida, and the meeting was only about one thing: how can they appeal to the nonpartisan independent voters? What can they do better? So they are starting to see that. The other thing that I think those voters probably get more frustrated by is gerrymandering, the hyper-partisan way that things are happening in states, in the way they're gerrymandered, closed primaries. All these voters are basically being left out of multiple decision points about American governance. I was in Oregon. The other day, and this is interesting coming from a blue state. Even Democrats in Oregon were saying we should open up our closed primary because there's so many independents who are basically disenfranchised because they cannot vote in the primary, and the primary determines the outcome of the election. That's a pretty fair argument. And so I do think those voters not only don't feel partisan, but when systems are hyper-partisan with closed primaries and intense gerrymandering, they're basically left without any Democratic home, small d.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Two more. Go with Scott and then Duncan.
Hey, Scott.
David, first of all, thank you. Love the book. Love the resources and all the links and the website that keeps it active. Big help. My question, I grew up in Kansas in a Republican family. My mother left the Republican Party before it left her, or she said it left her. I then lived in Minnesota with a very active urban Democratic Party and played in local and state politics a bit. I'm intrigued by the question of where the people who were Republicans go. Do they just become independent at this point? My mother basically became an independent because the Republican Party she knew disappeared, a party that had a more liberal wing, if you will, or a more moderate wing. Where do Republicans go? And is the Democratic Party prepared to be a big enough tent to let them in?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that some are independent. No, some frankly are still, in some ways it's healthy if they remain Republican because they could be a voice within their own primary. I tried very hard to help a guy who was running in the Republican primary for Congress. He actually was my former opponent for the county commission, but he was quite conservative, but we had a pretty nasty race. But since Trump won, he's been unbelievable about democracy and standing up for after January 6th. And so I really wanted him to win a primary amongst 10 others. And boy, do I wish a lot more people had stayed in the Republican Party so someone like him could win, but there just weren't enough there. He finished third or fourth in some of the bigger counties. So in some cases, staying and trying to fight back is healthy, but that moment may be gone. I mean, I think depending on what happens in November, the Republican Party I was at a conference where this was said a few days ago, the Republican Party of a Mitt Romney may be just gone forever. In that case, I think some will be independent, some will be independent but voting for Democrats. Victoria just mentioned the Forward Party. I was with Christine Todd Whitman last week, and they're working. Maybe it goes there. I mean, I do think there is, again, if Trump wins and they do well, we have a large Republican Party that's very extreme. If they lose and they have permanently branded the Republican Party as Trump's party, and he has, siphoned all the money from the party into whatever his legal bills are, the question after November may be, well, what's going to replace the Republican Party? So they either have a moment where they become Trump's party and that's it, and he's the president, or it may be that there's another vehicle that they all move to, because I think his loss and all the money he's diverting, and that's what he's doing when he takes it over, could make it pretty much extinct or like a fringy right-wing party with another to fill. So it's a really good question. But I think, if the Democrats are smart, they will, and this is happening to some degree. I live in Hamilton County, Cincinnati. Ann knows this area well. This was a red county. When I won the county commission here in 2006, it was the first time we had a majority county commission. There were three total in 40 years. Now it's totally blue. Why? Because all the former moderate Republicans, particularly women in the suburbs, are pretty much Democrats. That's happening in a lot of places. The question is, outside of that demographic, where do others go? And I think it's going to be independent. I think it's going to be Democrat. And it might give a shot for another party. Again, if the Republican Party implodes, I worry that if Trump wins, obviously it's a new life, and it's just a very different party than the party of Romney or Liz Cheney.
Yeah, great. Thank you, David. We'll go to Duncan.
Duncan?
Yeah, hi. This has been fantastic. Thank you. So I'm involved with movements that are trying to bring more deliberative democracy into our democracy and create more spaces like citizen assemblies and such for people to participate. I'm also hanging out a lot with an independent movement, that's trying to come together and talk about different alternatives. And so I guess I'm wondering, specifically today, I was listening to the New York Times, had this great poll where they're basically showing that a huge amount of people think that the system just needs to be totally changed, and that the reason why Trump is more popular is because they think that the change is going to happen there. So for the folks that are out here saying, wow, we need to really rethink how this democracy is happening, and all these kind of independent voices, that right now is getting channeled into RFK Jr. or something like that.
Right.
All of your analysis here, it's go towards the local, right? I mean, would that be your advice? I guess maybe is my question, or what other thoughts you have?
I mean, I'll be very clear. I think that everyone needs to understand what the 2025 Trump plan is. The system may be maybe not what it needs to be, but it's still a democracy to some degree. And it will not be if that plan and everyone who helped write it are empowered by Trump. So I was at, again, I was like,
yeah, I'll put the link for that in the chat for sure, so people know about that.
Yeah, and so we have a fire that's burning the house down. We got to put out the fire by November. All hands on deck for that. And then we got a lot of work to do to do better than what we have now. And by the way, when I say put out the fire for November, I'm not just talking about presidential. I'm talking about those great Arizona candidates I mentioned running really well. I'm talking about the reform in Ohio to end gerrymandering passing. I'm talking about electing Supreme Court justices in a state like Ohio that respect the reproductive freedom initiative that passed last year. So my frame is always to see that democracy is on the ballot in multiple levels. And Duncan, one of the things I like about that frame is I actually think in this kind of year, there may be a lot more people inspired by that 25-year-old running for state house than the presidential candidate that they're probably going to vote for, but that may not inspire them to show up because they don't agree on everything. So I think one of the best parts about seeing the democracy battle at all levels is there are many more entry points for voters. But if you don't run in half these places, they don't exist. So I do think that thinking about it at all levels, seeing the in an odd year, this is school board race. I mean, the school boards right now in America are a frontline democracy battle. Do you censor? Do you defund? Do you send the money to private players? Or do you try and have a good public school system? Do you trust teachers and librarians to determine what should be taught in schools and not the angry parent down the street? That's the battle. So once you start showing people that, oh, you care about democracy and these issues, they're on your ballot all the time. My hope is that leads to a more engaged electorate and gives people more, as much as I have a pretty dark view of what's happening in the states, I'm also always inspired because I'm meeting the people who are running for these offices in tough places, and they have incredible stories. And so we need more people like that who I think will inspire people to participate, that they maybe won't participate if they only think of it as a battle between two men who are closer in their 80s. I mean, it gives multiple entry points that oftentimes they otherwise don't see.
Well, thank you, David. How about you, Scott? You have a question or a
Yeah,
comment?
a quick one. I think I've heard somewhere a suggestion that candidates in particular shouldn't talk about democracy. They should talk about issues. And democracy turns all of us on or we wouldn't be here. But
Right.
I've also seen the polls that suggest that the average citizen doesn't really care that much.
Sadly, I actually agree with that advice generally. But what I would say is, and that's funny coming from a guy who named his darn book Saving Democracy. We got to make it real for people. One, if you're right now 20 years old and all you've seen is the crazy politics we've had for the last 10 years, you're up to your ears in student debt. Do you think democracy is all that great for you? No, it doesn't seem to be great. Everything seems nuts. If you're 25, you literally, when you were 12, let's say you were African-American, you're 25. From the time you were 12, your president, he had his citizenship questioned because of the color of his skin, and the guy who questioned it became president. Do you think democracy is all that great? Not really, because it seems nuts. So, and sometimes I think those of us on the age of people on this call, we lived at a little calmer time, and maybe the problems were a little below the surface, but we did think, oh, democracy, good. And so I think one is we have to define it, but two, we have to make it clear to people who haven't experienced as positive democracies. Let's say I grew up thinking about, well, losing democracy is Dobbs. Losing democracy is you live in a state where there's an abortion ban, no exceptions, even though 60% of your state doesn't agree with that. Or most of you agree that no books should be banned, but they're banned anyway. Or most of you think there should be common sense gun laws to stop school shootings, but there are none and there are people dying in your schools. The more we can connect the lack of democracy to the real issues that affect lives.
Yeah.
So the 30-second ad maybe doesn't even say the word democracy, but it's connecting up the problem when you lose democracy. And one reason last November of 22, if you remember, middle of 22, there were a whole lot of election-denying Secretary of State candidates running, and it was scary because, 22 Democrats in the White House, those were the favorites. They should have won. You would have had an election denier running the elections of Arizona and Nevada and other states. They all lost. Every swing state election die or unrestricted state lost. And if you look closely at the ads that were run, one, they did mention election denying. I mean, it doesn't compute to most voters that you'd have an election denier be the one counting votes. But number two, most of those candidates attached it to Dobbs as well. Their ads were about democracy and Dobbs and freedom. Josh Shapiro beat Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. He talked about real freedom, democracy, and post-Dobbs women's freedom. So I think connecting up to the way that the lack of democracy can turn your life upside down in real ways, not 30,000 foot, but on the ground, that to me is the key. So if all we do is run around and say democracy, I agree. It's not, it'll connect with those of us in a room like this. But when you're getting out to the sort of the voters who are worried about everything in their life right now, and this feels a little bit academic, you got to connect on the real world impact of that lack of democracy. And the good candidates are doing that.
Yeah, this theme's come up again, and it may be like a little broken record, but you know, part of looking at this whole notion of transforming education and democracy is to keep remembering that we are all human beings.
Yeah.
So part of the whole notion of you can't possibly have a democracy if you don't have people who are acting like human beings.
Yeah.
I think part of it too, like this conversation, is keep remembering that and notice the kind of relationships and the emotions and all of the thing that's going on in this conversation. And then you and I being really responsible to continue this. And that's why having the PowerPoint that David's going to sending it out to all of you so you can share it. I just think it's really, really important. I mean, this has been so extraordinary. David, Pepper, are just so great that you came. But keep going. I think we have a little more time if we want.
I got to jump in a second. I got a little event upstairs, but
okay, good. Well, he's got to jump in a second. So anything else that you all
any
want to say?
final questions?
Are you thinking about turning both books into a course that could be taught at the high school level?
I haven't, no, but I'm always trying to figure out how to get my stuff out there. What's funny is I teach a course on election law and voting rights, and I try and get that taught out more broadly, but I'll let me think about that.
Yeah.
Because it's not, the first book is a session. If you've read the first book, which is sort of it's sort of the here's the problem book, it really is a civics class about how democracy is truly shaped from the bottom up and how not seeing that is a real risk.
Yeah.
So that would be the one I'd love to turn into like a basic book that people would learn. I love when a 20-year-old has my book. I'm thinking, man, I wish I had known all that at 20, because it really gives them a view of democracy that often we're not taught at all.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Well, we'll reach out again and ask that while you're thinking about it, and we'll keep supporting you. Anybody else? Because this has just been, I don't know. I just always look into my body and go like, oh, whoopee. This was just such a great conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, David. It was awesome.
Thanks, everybody. Stay in touch.
Yeah.
I'll see you.
Okay. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
David.
Bye.
We could stay on a little bit if